Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from Electronic Armory. In this video, we're going to add a table view to a previous application that we've been building in this series on iOS development. If you haven't watched that previous video yet, go ahead and watch that to understand how the application's base is built, but it's not strictly necessary. So let's get started adding UI table views to our application. So as I mentioned, we're going to use a previous project that we built in another video and build upon that by adding a table view to that. So our previous project was called Two Views, so I'm going to select that to open this up. All right, and so to remind you what that looks like, we're going to run this really quickly on the iPhone X. And once that's up and running, we just have this simple to-do button up here to add a new to-do. This is a to-do application. And if I just type in some text here and save that to-do, that view controller goes away, and then we're left with this home view controller. And this is just a text view. And if we add another one, let's say some different text in there, you can see that it just gets appended to the text view. And there's no way to delete it. So what we ultimately want to do is add a table view so that on this first to do, we can swipe left to delete. And this will be a nice table view that will scroll as we add more and more items. So let's go ahead and refactor this so that instead of a text view, we replace that with a table view. So if we go back to our application, I'm just going to go ahead and stop it and go into our main storyboard and wait for this to load up. I'm going to close our debug window there, and I'm simply going to delete this. However, there's a few things that we need to know about before deleting this, and that is the connection to this variable here, this reference. And so if we open up our side panel on the right here and click on that text view, we have a connections tab, and we can see all the connections that this is connected to, namely that it's connected to our text view in our view controller. So I'm actually going to want to cut that connection, because if I delete something, let's say I delete this line of code here, and I leave this widget on the screen, we'll get a runtime error. And there's lots of things that happen when you just go ahead and just delete these. It's kind of strange behavior. So what I usually like to do as a best practice is disconnect these connections before deleting those. So once that's disconnected there, you can see that that circle is hollow. And of course I can reconnect it like that and disconnect it as well from our side panel here. It's one of the easiest ways to do it. Again, I'm going to go ahead and delete that line of code, and then I am going to delete that entire widget. Now let me switch over to just the editing mode here, and I'm going to add a table view in its place. So down in our widgets, if I type in table view, we have a table view controller that takes up the whole entire view controller, but that's not very nice, and that's usually not how applications are built. Instead, we have a separate standalone table view widget that we drag in just like any other option. And this will give us the ability to have buttons and other widgets on the screen, whereas the normal table view takes up the entire view controller, and there's no way to add in buttons or anything. I mean, it kind of goes into the whole cell. So I usually don't like to use table view controllers as a whole, but instead, and go ahead and just delete that, as a separate standalone widget. Now this takes a little bit more setup, so I'm gonna have to drag this to full screen and then drag this up and keep our to-do there. And I'm going to add constraints so that this always takes up the full length and height of our view here. And the easiest way to do that is go over here to our source menu. If you don't see that, there's a little button down here that shows and hides that. And I'm going to simply drag, control left click, drag from table view up to our parent view. So do that, and I'm gonna just select all of these. So leading edge, trailing edge, top space, and bottom space. Actually, I will not do the top space because I want to make it relative to that button. So leading space, trailing space, so that's the left and the right, bottom space, and then I'm going to manually over here control click and drag it up to the button and do vertical spacing there, and that should get rid of all of our layout warnings here. It's still saying for the to do from the previous video, and that's fine. And so that'll set up the layout for our table view. And if we go ahead, actually, if I go ahead and remove the code from our previous video, so I removed that code just so it now compiles. I'm going to go back to our main storyboard because there's one thing that we have to set up for our table view now. And I'm going to go to the attributes tab, and it's going to give us some attributes to edit on our table view. So what we want to do is make sure that dynamic prototypes is set up so that we can see what the table view cells are going to look like. But those prototype cells right now in this default view are none. So we want to go up here in the top right hand corner and select prototype cells and just change that to, you could basically do 1, and that will give you what our cell or our table view row is going to look like. And so now that that's added, this doesn't add rows to our table, it's just kind of a visualization of what's going to be there. If I hit this disclosure arrow, we can actually select the table view cell itself. And the most important thing that we want to do, this is a very important step, and if you miss it, your table view won't work, is to select that prototype cell and set its reuse identifier. And so that's up here in the top right hand corner. If you do not see this, make sure that your cell is selected. I usually like to select it from this hierarchy here because sometimes it gets a little finicky when you're trying to select it from the UI here. All right, so what goes into the reuse identifier? Basically any type of description that describes this particular cell type. Now, if you have multiple table views in your application, you might have different cell types. But for us, I'm just going to type in cell, and all lowercase, and that's going to be our reuse identifier. What the reuse identifier is going to be is when the table view scrolls, let's say I'm scrolling and these table cells, maybe there's 100 of them, or 100 items in my table view. As these cells or as these rows scroll off the screen, as they kind of go up here, they're actually going to get dequeued from that list and move down to the bottom so that they can move up. Very similar to a treadmill. If you picture a treadmill moving up, well, those cells that kind of go off the top here, after they go up enough, they'll go kind of back around and get requeued back to the bottom. And so at any given point, you don't have necessarily 100 table view rows or cells. You might just have maybe 10, and they're just getting recycled as you're scrolling up. And that way the system doesn't have to allocate the memory for all those as you're scrolling really quickly. And so it's just a very efficient, optimized method of doing this. And so we need to know what the reuse identifier is because you might have different cell types. We won't get into that in this video, but just know that we need a name to call this particular cell type. All right, so that's what that is. So copy that text if it's long. I always like to copy and paste. And we're going to use that in a second, but in our view controller, we have to set up our view controller to handle the table views, rows, and sections, and some of the data that it's going to start requesting. And to do that, we're going to just make sure that the table view is selected, not the cells. And I'm going to control drag up to this yellow icon that's on the left here. And then once I release that, we get a few outlets that we can connect our table view from to our view controller. And namely, we want our data source and our delegate. And so what that's asking is we're asking the view controller that the code that lives behind this view to act as a data source, meaning where the data is coming for each row, and the delegate from it. So we got to do this twice. So control left click. It looks like I didn't drag it from the table view. So make sure that's selected and hook up both the data source and the delegate. Now, what do those look like? Let's go to our view controller that is the code behind. And we're going to make sure that our view controller adheres to those protocols. So after the subclass, we're subclassing UIViewController. So that's the parent class or the superclass. I want to also add protocols, and this is just a comma separated list. And I just start typing in UITableView, and there is a delegate here. So we're going to go ahead and select that, comma, UITableView data source. There it is, should come up. So again, TableView delegate and TableView data source. Once we add those two protocols that we're going to adhere to, we can then start to add in their methods that will implement that protocol. So if you just type in func and just type in Tableview. It'll give you all of the Tableview data source functions as well as the delegate functions. You can scroll up and down to see what these do. What we're interested in is our Tableview is going to ask this delegate or our data source, how many sections should I show? Sections are very similar to, say, the address book, where you have the section might be A, and everybody whose last name begins with A will be under that section A. And so in that example, we have 26 sections, at least in the US alphabet. So I want the sections here. So how many, we have number of rows in sections. We'll get to that in a second. So I'm going to hit space and just type in section, and it's going to have a function here called number of sections in Tableview. So that's actually the one I want. I'm going to hit enter on that, but it's going to kind of do some funky stuff with our code because I got to it in a slightly different manner. All right, so number of sections. In our particular case, if I hit Control/, I'm just going to simply return 1. We're just going to have 1 section, so it's pretty boring, but we do need to implement that. Next thing I want to do is same thing, FUNC, and then again, Tableview to bring up all of our functions here. And the next thing we're interested in is the number of rows in section. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, and it's going to say how many rows in each section. So for example, if we had an address book, say how many rows are in section A, or that would probably be section 0, but you get the idea. For us, what we're going to want to do is, again, returns on these are integers. We want to return the number in the array that we have. And if you remember from the previous video, we have a to-do controller that holds a to-dos array. And we just simply want to return the number of items in that array. And so that array starting off of the application will be 0. As we add stuff to it, this will get called again and again. And this count will say, okay, I have 1 item, 2 item, etc. All right, so the next thing that we need to do for this is we need to make sure that we are returning a cell with data in it that will basically be our to-do. So it'll ask, what should I show for row 0, for row 1, etc. And so we have to give it a cell populated with some text or some string that basically is the value of that to-do. So again, if we just type in Tableview, I'm going to hit space on this and hit cell because I know that I need to return a cell for this. So this is the one we want, Tableview cell for row at index, and it's going to return a UITableView cell. All right, so I'm going to hit enter on that, and it also does a little bit of funky stuff on here. Normally what I do is I'll actually create a new file and go to Cocoa Touch, and the type for this one would be like a UITableViewController, and I generate that because what that's going to do is generate a lot of the boilerplate code that I'm typing in manually here. But I wanted to show you that how we do this and what each method or function does. All right, so for our cell for row, what we want to do first is see if we have an available cell that we can dequeue. Remember, as it goes, all these cells go off the screen. We can dequeue that and then place it at the bottom if it's scrolling up, or dequeue it from the bottom and place it at the top if it's scrolling down, etc. What we want to do is see if one's available, and if it's not, it'll actually go ahead and create one for us. It'll allocate the memory. So we're going to let just a generic cell equal, and I'm going to start this off by typing in Tableview because we're going to dequeue it from the Tableview itself. And I'm going to type in dequeue, and we're going to want the second one here. So dequeue reusable cell. Remember, we talked about that on our storyboard with identifier. So this is where we put in that string identifier, namely cell, all lowercase, for an index path. Basically, we're giving it an index path. The index path is essentially a way of saying this row in this section, etc. So I'll just go ahead and show you what this looks like. So for the identifier, it's cell, which we typed in our storyboard for that particular cell type. And then for index path, we're actually getting that value passed into us here. So I'm simply just going to paste that in there. All right, so what this function does, you can click on it and click on this question mark over here to read more about it if you're interested in it. But again, it'll try to dequeue or reuse a cell if one exists, and if not, it'll create it for us. And then finally, we want to return that cell once we've created it or dequeued it. Now that's not very interesting because it'll just pass back a blank cell. And so on our cell types, and you can create custom cell types, but on the cell we have a text label, and in that text label we have actual text, and we want to set that text to something in particular, namely the to-do that corresponds with that. So for example, our index path at a particular section will say will be 0, and we want to go get the index at 0 for that particular array. And so we can go ahead and get our to-dos array from our to-dos controller and just do a square bracket for the index and do the index path dot row. And so again, our row will be 0, it'll be 1, however many exist based on the value of this. So for example, if this to-dos array had 10 items in it, this function will probably get executed about 10 times, depending upon what's being displayed on the screen. This row value will be 0, it'll be 1, it'll be 2, etc., up to 9. And what these values are strings. These come out as strings. So if they're objects, you'd have to pull the string out of the object. Okay, so once we go ahead and do that, this should allow us to update it. However, when we add items to our to-do controller, when we get back to this initial view controller from our, let's see, where is this? The to-do view controller. If you remember, this is where we actually enter in the text for our to-dos to add them. It'll go back to the view controller. We have no way of updating the table view. The table view will just think that the data hasn't changed. And so in our view did appear, simply do a table view. We don't have a reference to that yet. Sorry, I skipped a step. So we need a reference to our table view before we start manipulating it. So if we go back to our main storyboard and do our assistant and take that table view, control click into our class, so that we have a table view instance that we can reference. So connect that just like every other outlet that we have. Okay, go ahead and make this a little bit smaller. And down here, now this should work. So if autocomplete doesn't work, then it probably doesn't exist. So tableview.reload data. So again, when our view comes back onto the screen, it'll ask our table view to reload its data, which will essentially just execute these methods again and again every time we call reload data. Okay, so we have that, and let's see if this works now. So we're going to go ahead and compile this. All right, so here's our application, pretty boring. If we go to new to do, it'll bring up this, this new second view controller. I'm just going to type in a couple of pieces of text here and hit this save to do. And so now we have it in our row. It's a table view. We can scroll up and down. If we do a new to do, let's say different text here, save that to do, it goes in here. So I can add a few more pieces as well, and it just goes in. And if we had multiple items in here, it would scroll eventually. So pretty cool. The only problem with this application is we have no way of deleting these. Normally in applications, if I go ahead and select this, this is not implemented. But if I go ahead and left click and slide to the left here, we should have in normal applications a delete. So let's go ahead and implement that really quickly and see how we can get that functionality in our table view. Okay, so just like every other function, we're going to start it off by typing in table view, and you can scroll through the list of functions here. But the one I'm interested in is the table view commit editing style at row index path. And so you can find that manually if you want to, or you can just start typing in something like editing style and see what we have. Now, this is not the one that we want. The one that we want does not return a value. So make sure you just type in editing style, and it's going to actually be the second one. You can't read. My text is a little larger than normal, but you can't read the whole entire thing. So it's this one that I want, and it should match this method signature. So make sure you have the same signature as I do if you're following along. And let's go ahead and start implementing this. So really what we're going to check first is what kind of editing style is being passed in. So what I'm interested in is the editing style of delete. So I'm going to say if the editing style is equal to the delete editing style, and you can see that we have editing style here. I'm going to paste that in and do a dot notation on that, and you can see that we have delete there. So if the editing style is equal to this constant delete, go ahead and start executing some code. Now, of course, in Swift, if you remember, we don't need this entire class here to denote the delete. It just knows that, of course, it's looking for an editing style to compare it to. Therefore, it's going to automatically fill that in. So just, a little quick tip there. Once we've determined that it's going to be a delete, it could also be an insert, but we don't have that functionality readily available to us at this moment. We're going to first, the most important thing that we do first, otherwise our application will crash, is we actually want to remove the to-do at that particular index. And so if you remember from our previous video, we did implement a remove to-do at a particular index. And so that index is going to be the index path. However, an index path, if you remember, is a two-dimensional object. It's a section and a row in that section. I just want the row out of that to say, delete the first item, delete the second item, etc. So we first have to delete it from the array before removing it from the table view. So once we remove it from the array, and again, the order does matter, otherwise you'll get a runtime crash. The table view has a delete method on it, so we can delete rows at particular index paths. And I'm simply going to put in brackets the index path, and that will delete multiple rows, but we're just going to simply do one. With table view row animation, we can have a whole bunch of different row animations by typing in a dot, and it will be other things like fade, etc. So I'm just going to choose fade for this one, and that'll give us a fade effect when we go ahead and delete that row. And that's really all that we need in order to delete to-dos from our table view. The signature for this does not match exactly. Sorry about that. It's just me trying to show you how this is pretty explicitly typed in. So once we get that all set up, let's launch our application, our simulator. And again, we have this table view here, and I'm going to type in or click on new to do. I'm going to say first to do, save that. That'll go here. New to do, make sure that's selected. That should be the first responder. Second to do, save that. And let's add a third to do. And just for fun, we'll just add another fourth to do. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start deleting these things. So I'm going to actually remove the third to do by clicking and swiping left. Now you see that this actually works. If I swipe left a little bit, we get this delete to confirm. I can click on it to cancel it. But if I go ahead and select from the far right-hand corner and continue to delete that, once I release, it automatically deletes that for me. Whereas if I wanted to delete the first one, I would have to explicitly click on that and delete it. Okay, and so that's how we deal with table views, adding rows and deleting them. So I hope you found this video useful. We're going to continue introducing you piece by piece to new elements in Swift 4. So hopefully you're enjoying the series. If you are, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Feel free to share it amongst your friends if anybody wants to learn iOS development. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.